Welcome back to TechTalk Podcasts, brought to you by Certes IT Service Solutions. We're picking up where we left off in our conversation on the technology budget. Is it an art or a science? Joining us again are Jon Grainger and Steve Butler. In this episode, we explore the impact of shadow IT on budgeting, how IT architecture shapes financial decisions, and how to communicate value for money and return on investment in business terms. Let's dive into part 2.
Do you cover, Steve, in your book, but if not in your book, in your experience, the shadow IT? It might be worth just saying to listeners who don't know what shadow IT is, you have your IT budget that's controlled, it should be controlled by your IT department through normal governance, etc., with help from procurement. But there is the ability to procure software services, typically SaaS services via the web, with a credit card. And so that becomes much harder to police. It's getting a lot easier to see it, depending on how you've set things up from a tech point of view. But you can't be there at the point at which a business person decides to use a credit card to buy something. I'm wondering, Steve, whether this fits into the budget where we say, well, tell you what, we'll put our hands up and take responsibility for this shadow IT because we're not meeting a need of the business. So whatever's happening, even though, you could argue that shouldn't be happening, strictly speaking, it is a gap in what IT is providing if people are having to go elsewhere, and they're not just going elsewhere, they're getting their credit cards out. So do you have a view of, when you're looking at that software, not just the software that you should be getting rid of, but maybe the software that you haven't bought yet, or the gaps, that sort of thing. So what's your thoughts on that identifying gaps and justifying increases in budget?
I think, in all honesty, it's a good thing. And, I think when you look at things, there's opportunities out there to automate things in the business, do things better. And something in the center isn't necessarily the best way of delivering that. When you look at what you can do with Copilot, other tools now, they're evolving. We're talking about exponential growth. So these things are going to get more powerful that we can get our heads around very, very quickly. And I think if you can empower some of your users to do things, become more productive, might be for a small team, so you wouldn't build an IT system for it, but it's got to be a good thing. And what we've got to do is support them, but then almost put the bits in place there. So we've covered GDPR, it's backed up, all those things. So we built in a corporate platform, on the right sort of operating system with the security underneath that. And we've just got to make sure we know about the data. It's not being stored offshore, outside of the EU, all those sorts of things. And it's funny because I've been to quite a lot recently. We have an AI working group. We seriously looking at the categories out there. What tools should we have? How do we almost catalogue the data, make sure we understood what's there? And you need to use tools to sort of help with that and automatically classify. So long as you can get some of that done, I think it's a very good thing. You've got Microsoft Graph, all sorts of tools like that, which will help with this. I'm all for it, to be honest with you. Funny enough, you were talking about this, and I've been through this exercise on a very large scale when you're looking at a major sort of PLC. And you do the scanning, you're looking at the assets and things, and you discover that, for example, for Adobe or one or two of these things, that there's 10 equivalents out there. People have used open source things, they've used other tools which do the same thing. So there's substitution alternatives in marketing, so to speak. And you need to rationalize on it in some cases. And there's enormous benefit to doing it so long as you tackle that properly. You sort of have to know, you don't want to take away tools from people, but when people install a shareware tool, you've got to be very careful about licensing and things.
Yeah, there's an educational piece, isn't there, Steve? Because the shadow IT bit, I think, it's a bit of feedback to say we've missed something. But the risk that you have is, like you said, and I think this is to a lot of people that use just things over the web, they just won't be thinking about this at all. But just to use your examples, their data could be stored outside of the EU. If they don't have certain things in place like multi-factor authentication, it's very, very easy to be hacked. Just innocently, they don't realize quite how risky that behavior is. I think the other thing that I've observed, from my side of the table, is that the consumer applications run much, much faster than the corporate applications, because the consumer, set of rules isn't as strict as the corporate set of rules. So when you look at how fast some of the AI tools are, the consumer AI tools, how quickly they're advancing, even when compared to some of the leading corporate AI providers, they are definitely stealing a lead. And people are saying, well, these are much better. You're saying, yeah, but the corporate tool is really looking after the data. Just take an LLM, for example, Steve. There's a big difference between grounding your data and training. And what people don't realize when they're using a lot of consumer applications is that their data that they are putting into the prompt is training the model for other people to use. So indirect way, their personal data or whatever data they're using is going into that public model. Whereas grounding, it's staying inside the secure, perimeter of the corporate IT. Now, the issue is that the folks that do grounding can't go quite at the same pace as the folks that are doing training, because it's kind of consumer versus corporate. So I think that's just one of those background things. It's like one of the 100 things you'd need to explain when you're talking about the risks of shadow IT. I didn't want to go too far down that particular rabbit hole, Steve, but it is related to budgeting. But I wanted to bring it back into if you were advising a CIO, CTO of they're preparing their budget, and they're trying to land some of the budget messages in business terms rather than in technology terms. And maybe we could also cover off the kind of the value for money. The classic is, 50%, is people and 34% is software. What is all this stuff? That kind of classic challenge that you have to communicate across to the business what's happening in business technology. Do you have any tips on conveying that budget message?
It's fundamentally about relatability, speaking the right language, because the business particularly doesn't want to be an IT expert. They've got you in the background. And I think you're in such a better place as a CTO, also a senior manager, if you're relating those things back. And it's the same with the business case, because fundamentally it's about the return on investment. And, this cost avoidance, cost saving, being able to do something quicker, get more revenue in, everything ultimately should relate back to that. Yes, you've got overheads and things, and you do with any other part of the business. Not every part of the business makes revenue directly and things like that, so they are overheads, but you justify those. You've also got the compliance side these days as well, more and more. The cost of not being compliant can potentially be enormous in terms of monetary sort of fines and reputational damage, all these things. But one of the more interesting things I've seen with something like, say, Agile, but we've all been around IT for a long time. We tend to have a slightly cynical view about some frameworks and things. But one of the things I was really surprised about with SAFe is a lot of it, you could run your business off SAFe. It's not necessarily an IT thing. It wasn't designed as that. And at one level, it's got some very, very good stuff about strategic and almost looking the direction of your business and how you take those business drivers and map them back to different areas, almost architectural runways, and how do you plan your sort of backlogs, product backlogs, all those things. Done properly, and it's actually quite simple. You can very much relate everything back to all these new costs you're putting in, why, and as it feedback and support the business and things. It's surprisingly good, and I was really, really surprised at some of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we won't turn this into an agile session or the background, but I think with it either started or a very, very early use of agile, maybe before it was called agile, was actually in a business context. I think it was to do with a US system, government system that was being, looked at. So it didn't necessarily was born in the kind of the technical space. Steve, I've got a very specific question for you. So I've worked in lots of different contexts with lots of different IT budgets, and in some there's a dedicated procurement professional inside the IT team. Sometimes there's a dedicated procurement professional outside of the IT team, and sometimes there isn't any procurement specialist. And so I wanted to kind of see if it might not be, exactly prescriptive, but in your experience, is there a sort of a spend level that once you get to that spend level, you should absolutely have a procurement person in IT?
It's an interesting one, actually, because I do think you need that input. And yes, there's certainly a size where it makes sense. There's a lot of things around licensing and things like that, which are specialist areas. And at the very least, you should have an external partner to sort of secure your software. If you take Microsoft, some of the other vendors, the cost of not doing it properly can be quite frightening. And, potential lawsuits, all sorts of things. So it pays to get it right. And get it right, and you're really reducing your cost anyway by selecting the most appropriate sort of licensing model. And these days, I think legal's much more involved as well. And almost all your contracts, you're always looking for what's the gotchas, what happens if something goes wrong, the exit points, contingent liabilities, all these sorts of things.
Yes.
A small company may not make sense, but I'd look to have a partner out there who buys the software for you. Actually, you can do the checking things. Something goes wrong, you're on the hook, but ultimately you're back to back it with them. You protect yourself. If you're looking at benchmarking, I go up a level, you almost need a specialist who understands IT, because some of this is about architecture. The point you can make the biggest difference to IT costs and spend is when you architect the systems in the first place, or you transform them. And that's the bit which usually gets missed.
That's where they say to you, Steve, can you tell me the way to London? And they say, I wouldn't start from here. Yeah. If you get the architecture wrong, you haven't got that glide path, or, so it's huge. So I always talk about kind of addressable spend and unaddressable spend. And the sort of the architectural strategy is to make the unaddressable addressable. Yeah. And then once it's addressable, then to get it at the right level. So you've got the SaaS services, we've talked about them and the costs going up. But when you buy into a platform, be it an Amazon, a Google, or a Microsoft, there's a whole set of services that you get. So this is more maybe in the space of journey to cloud rather than SaaS, if we make that distinction. And so it's very easy to procure additional servers because you press a button and you have one. What's your take on that? Because that, for me, I think that's where it's not even necessarily a procurement role. It might be a dedicated role that's just keeping on top of that spend, because we've all heard of like bill shock and, these kind of SaaS costs running away. Have you had experience in that space?
It's such a subject, as you say, but it's great you touched on that, actually, because it's such an area. It almost starts at a higher level. Because these days, if you're looking about how you deliver a solution, you've almost got in-house infrastructure as a service, platforms as a service, SaaS, these things. And it's a matter of picking probably the best one where you can. Sometimes you start because there's sort of constraints, but very often transformation is fundamentally about moving maybe from in-house to one of those other ones. But you've got to understand the pros and cons, what's most appropriate. And the architecture also governs a lot of the costs and things. So it needs some brain power on top of that, sort of get it right. Once you get it in, it almost flips. It's a bit like a business case. If you were the small business, a startup, you're looking for funding, there's an old joke that you'll almost always get you'll be over-optimistic about your income and you underestimated your costs.
Well, actually, Steve, that's a really good one, because I think a kind of a superficial look at your spend will negate the effort to remove the cost and will not talk about the replacement cost. So if you've got a bit of software, it's costing you X, you can't just switch it off unless it's not being used. So let's say it's being used, but it could also be moved on to something. You've got a consolidation opportunity. Yeah, the cost, the total sort of, not economic costs, but the sort of the wider business case would be, okay, we've got the opportunity to remove it, but we're going to have to put some effort into removing it. That will have an opportunity cost because those folks will either not be doing something else, or we buy some people in to do that move. And then whatever we move it to, on the kind of the physics principle of the you can't destroy energy, there's going to be some sort of increase, but obviously the business case is that's just going to be marginal compared to having two versions of things that do the same thing. And then you've got to get the timing right, because you need to know when you'll make that transfer. And not only that, if you stop using it, you might still have a few months left on your contract, so you can't monetize it. So there's that's like a mini kind of little puzzle to solve, isn't it? With every single bit of consolidation.
You go through that almost every time.
Yeah.
You're trying to minimize impacts and things anyway, so you try and avoid year ends, all sorts of things like that. But fundamentally, as you see, there's very often a short-term view that, these servers cost me X and hosting. If I move it into the cloud, it's 50% cheaper. But there's so much more to that. You've got the effort of moving it and things and other sort of considerations there. And you've got to put the two things together. What is the cost saving when I moved it, cost to move? And, a bit of contingency on there, because some of the more complex ones, there may be other interactions that you dig out later. Some cases are easy. There's low hanging fruit against it. Some things there are enormous savings to be made. And very often you'll focus on those first, doing those. But FinOps is another one. And even, the term of coin recently, sort of AI ops, because there's also a massive cost involved in building AI, in the cloud and things. It can cost you way more than you think, particularly if you're training models, retraining. But you need FinOps, you need other things in there. You need those disciplines. But you've really got to watch it, because people will build more than you think. There'll be more test environments spun up than you thought was going to be built. And you've got to keep control on it, and you've got to try and forecast where you can and put some hidden contingencies in your back pocket.
Yes. And I think timing then becomes really interesting, Steve, because my favorite time to do something like this is in month 1 of the new financial year, because I've got a chance to get it done in year. So if you can literally get the whole thing done in year, you're not even asking for any budget funding, because you can cover it. But it's easier said than done. So Steve, we're coming to sort of the end of the period, but just a couple of things I'm reflecting on speaking to you. The first thing is I feel like we've just scratched the surface of your book, like hardly covered it. That was the first point, and I'm definitely going to be getting that one on Amazon this evening. So thanks for that. The second point is just how intertwined an understanding of IT architecture relates to your costs. If you want to structurally, substantively change your cost base, you obviously want to procure things wisely. You want to make sure you're using things efficiently. All the 101 stuff, which actually it's not necessarily 101 because it might not be obvious to people. But that that kind of procurement specialism, professionalism, etc. But to get the unaddressable costs to be addressable, that's more of an architecture play, isn't it? It's a real sort of, let's look at it, and then you need to know, like we said at the start of the call, what's happening with SaaS costs 3 years from now, build versus buy, these kind of bigger
the life cycle costs and things which really get put in a business case. So what happens when that product comes to end of life? Have you factored in there? You've got to replace it. It's all these things, isn't it? So things to think about.
Cool. So it's a cliche, Steve, at the end of all these sorts of episodes, we kind of do what's your takeaway? What if you had one thing to tell the audience, or that sort of thing? But just in the topics that we've been covering, and thinking about the audience as being people who are responsible for IT budgets or they're affected by them. If you were to kind of leave some guidance for folks of what they've watched this episode, what should they do next in your opinion? What do you think their next step should be?
It's almost knowing what you've got. So it's the old adage about you can't manage what you can't measure. So you need to have some, I suppose, almost a spreadsheet, some tracking of all of the different services you've got and what's underneath them. And it's also understanding what are those points where you've got to renew contracts with vendors. There's significant work coming up. The database vendors and things, very often they depreciate versions. You've got major work to go to some of the later ones and things. If you can track some of those sort of events, it gives you some very clear signposts about when you need to do things. So it might be 3 years away, but it comes around very rapidly. You need time to think. Getting on top of that view is probably the single most important thing.
I love that. It's so obvious. I never thought of it. And this is like you're getting your 3 years of milestones. So you actually know how much runway you've got to do between each event. brilliant, Steve. So for everyone listening, Steve Butler knows his onions. He hasn't left us with some sort of philosophical statement. So that is a really good thing. I encourage everyone to do exactly what Steve just said if you are running or accountable for a budget. So Steve, I just want to say a massive thank you for joining us today and for experiencing all the questions but it's been a really fascinating session for me. So thank you very much, Steve.
Really, no, thanks for your time. Enjoyed that.